In 1971, Philip Zimbardo selected the most psychologically healthy, most stable, most normal group of young men he could find. He screened them. He tested them. He confirmed they had no prior criminal history, no psychological disorders, no predisposition toward aggression. Then he put half of them in guard uniforms, put the other half in chains, placed them in a basement, and watched what happened. Within 36 hours, a guard was making prisoners do degrading exercises in the middle of the night. Within 2 days, one prisoner had a psychological breakdown so severe he had to be released. Within 6 days, Zimbardo, who was watching, had become so absorbed in the role of prison superintendent that a colleague had to pull him out. The experiment was scheduled to run 2 weeks. It was terminated after 6 days, not because the guards were evil, because they weren't. The most disturbing part of what Zimbardo documented is not the cruelty of the guards. It is the ordinariness of it. They were students, people like you, people who, outside that basement, would have told you they believed in human dignity, in fairness, in basic decency. None of that disappeared. It was simply overridden by something more powerful, the system they were placed inside. This mechanism is running right now in your workplace, your social environment, your family structure. Not at the same intensity, the same architecture. In the next 18 minutes, I'm going to decode Zimbardo's Lucifer effect, the specific situational forces that turn ordinary people into instruments of cruelty. I'm going to connect it to Milgram's 1963 obedience experiments, where 65% of ordinary Americans delivered what they believed were lethal electric shocks. I'm going to show you Hannah Arendt's concept of the banality of evil, why the most dangerous people are often not monsters, but bureaucrats. And I'm going to give you the framework to identify when these forces are operating in your own life. This framework has been tested not just in a Stanford basement but at Abu Ghraib, where military police with no prior history of abuse committed acts that shocked the world. Zimbardo testified as an expert witness, demonstrating the same situational architecture he had documented 30 years earlier. The pattern is not theoretical. Let's decode it. Zimbardo identified what he called the social situational triad, 3 interlocking forces that, when combined, produce extraordinary behavior in ordinary people. The first is the individuation, the loss of personal identity within a role. When the Stanford guards put on their uniforms, their sunglasses, their batons, they stopped being individual people. They became guards. The role came with an implicit script, and the script had no column for conscience. When you stop being yourself and start being a function, an employee, a soldier, a guard, a bureaucrat, you lose access to your own moral set. Not permanently, situationally. The costume does something to the person wearing it. The second is diffusion of responsibility in a hierarchy. Every individual believes that someone else is responsible for the overall direction of events. The guard follows orders. The officer follows policy, the general follows strategy, and at every level, the person who could stop it believes it is not their decision. This is not cowardice. It is a feature of how authority structures distribute and dissolve accountability. The third is graduated commitment. Nobody starts with the worst behavior. The first degradation is minor. The second is slightly worse. By the time the behavior has escalated to something that would have been unthinkable at the beginning, the person has already committed to a narrative in which it is normal. This is the boiling frog mechanism, not metaphorically, but neurologically. The brain recalibrates its sense of normal in real time. These 3 forces together create what Zimbardo called an evil barrel. Not evil apples in a good barrel. A barrel so structurally corrupted that it turns ordinary apples evil. Stanley Milgram conducted his obedience experiments at Yale in 1963, 2 years after the Eichmann trial. He wanted to understand how ordinary German citizens had participated in the Holocaust. What he discovered was that ordinary Americans were no different. The experimental design was this. A participant sat at a control board with levers marked with voltage levels from 15 volts to 450 volts. A researcher in a lab coat instructed them to ask questions to a person in an adjacent room, an actor, though the participant did not know this, and to administer an electric shock each time the person gave a wrong answer, increasing the voltage each time. At 150 volts, the actor in the other room began screaming in pain. At 300 volts, they demanded to be released. At 330 volts, they went silent, which was more terrifying than the screaming. At 450 volts, the board was marked with two words, XXX. 65% of participants in Milgram's original study pressed the final lever. Not because they were sadists, not because they didn't hear the screaming. They pressed it because a man in a lab coat told them the experiment required them to continue. When participants hesitated, the researcher said only 4 scripted phrases. Please continue. The experiment requires that you continue. It is absolutely essential that you continue. You have no other choice. You must go on. For senses, 65%, 450 volts. What Milgram documented was not cruelty. It was obedience, the same cognitive state that makes children functional in schools, soldiers effective in armies, employees reliable in corporations. The same mechanism, turned in a different direction. In 1961, Hannah Arendt attended the trial of Adolf Eichmann in Jerusalem. The Nazi administrator, who had coordinated the logistics of the Holocaust, she expected to find a monster. What she found disturbed her more than a monster would have. Eichmann was ordinary. He was polite. He was bureaucratic. He spoke in cliches. He did not appear to be a man consumed by hatred or ideology. He appeared to be a man who had been very good at his job, and whose job had been the systematic murder of millions of people. Arendt described what she observed as the banality of evil, the insight that the most dangerous form of wickedness is not demonic but administrative. It does not require hatred. It requires only the suspension of thought, the willingness to perform a function without examining the function's consequences. Evil, in this formulation, is not an excess of something dark. It is an absence of something essential, the capacity to think from the standpoint of the other. Eichmann could not do it. Not because he was broken, because the system he occupied had made it structurally unnecessary. You have never been placed in a Stanford basement. You have never been given a lever that goes to 450 volts. But the architecture is running. Every hierarchy you exist inside, corporate, institutional, social, contains versions of de-individuation, diffusion of responsibility, and graduated commitment. The question is not whether these forces are present. They are always present. The question is whether you can see them operating before they operate through you. Zimbardo's research produced one additional finding that rarely gets cited. In a variation of his study, he discovered that a single person, one participant who publicly refused to comply, could interrupt the pattern for an entire group. Social proof works in both directions. The first person to defect makes defection available to others. The first person to say this is not acceptable gives the others language to do the same. The architecture is not destiny. But you cannot disrupt what you cannot see. The Lucifer effect is not a story about bad people. It is a story about good people inside bad systems, and the almost total human failure to distinguish the two. We look at Abu Ghraib and see monsters. Zimbardo looked at Abu Ghraib and saw a Stanford basement 30 years later. The implications of that are not comfortable. They are necessary. If the sane forces that produced those events are structural rather than personal, if ordinary people, under the right conditions, will do things that the sane people in different conditions would find unconscionable, then the most important psychological skill is not self-belief. It is situational awareness, the ability to read the architecture you are operating inside before the architecture reads you. That is what Cipherr is for.